Imagine this. A bright 10-year-old girl walks into what her family believed was the safest, most inclusive school in their community. She was excited for her first day, ready to thrive under the guidance of her new teacher. But by the end of the day, her spirit was shattered. Why? Because that very teacher, the one meant to protect and uplift her, served her a grotesque, humiliating meal accompanied by words so cruel they left her questioning her worth. Her father knew something was wrong, and when he uncovered the truth, it wasn't just about his daughter. It was about a system that allowed such hate to exist unchecked. What happens next is a story of outrage, resilience, and a family's fight for justice. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking events that turned a place of promise into a battleground for change, and reveal how one brave little girl inspired a movement that would challenge prejudice in even the most progressive environments. Marcus Grant adjusted his tie nervously as he stood in front of the imposing gates of Riverside Academy. The building exuded a sense of prestige, its manicured lawns and brick facade a testament to the affluent, progressive neighborhood it was nestled in. It was everything he and Lisa had dreamed of when they decided to move into this community. Riverside wasn't just a school. It was a promise, a promise of opportunity, growth, and most importantly, a safe space where their 10-year-old daughter Ella could thrive. Lisa stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her smile was calm and confident, the kind of smile that had reassured Marcus countless times before. Today, it seemed to say, "We made the right choice." Together they watched as Ella stepped forward, her backpack slung over her shoulder and her braided hair bouncing with each step. She was the picture of excitement, her eyes wide with curiosity as she took in the sights and sounds of her new school. Ella had always been special, not just because she was their daughter, but because of the way she lit up every room she walked into. Bright, compassionate, and wise beyond her years, she had a way of making everyone around her feel seen and heard. She loved science experiments, devoured books about the natural world, and spent hours sketching plants and animals in her journal. To Marcus and Lisa, Ella was more than just a talented student. She was a beacon of hope, a reflection of everything they had worked so hard to give her. The decision to move to this neighborhood hadn't been easy. It meant taking on a larger mortgage, longer commutes, and leaving behind familiar faces. But for Marcus and Lisa, it was worth it. The sacrifices were small compared to what Riverside Academy offered, a chance for Ella to excel in an environment that celebrated diversity and academic excellence. Here, she wouldn't just be another student. She would have the tools to soar. The first bell rang, and a chorus of children's laughter echoed across the courtyard. Lisa leaned down, smoothing Ella's collar and brushing an invisible speck off her backpack. "You're going to do amazing, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. Ella grinned and hugged her tightly before turning to Marcus. He knelt down, his eyes level with hers. "Be yourself, princess," he said. "You're more than enough, just as you are." Ella nodded, her confidence unwavering. "I'll make you proud," she replied, her voice brimming with determination. With one last wave, she joined the stream of students heading toward the school entrance, disappearing into the sea of brightly colored backpacks and chatter. Marcus and Lisa stood there for a moment, watching until she was out of sight. The reality of what they had accomplished settled over them, a feeling of pride mixed with the quiet hope that this would be the start of something extraordinary. As they walked back to their car, Marcus glanced at Lisa. "We did good," he said simply. Lisa smiled, threading her fingers through his. "We did." Neither of them could have known how much this day would change their lives forever. The hallways of Riverside Academy buzzed with the quiet hum of parent-teacher conference night. The soft glow of fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, casting a warm ambiance over the colorful artwork adorning the walls. Each piece told a story, a testament to the creativity and diversity of the students who called this place their second home. Marcus and Lisa Grant strolled hand in hand, their footsteps echoing faintly as they approached Ella's home room. The air carried the faint scent of paper, chalk, and freshly cleaned floors, a familiar combination that evoked a sense of nostalgia. When they reached the classroom door, a cheerful voice called out, "Mr. and Mrs. Grant, welcome." Miss Parker, Ella's current teacher, stood by her desk, her face lighting up as she extended a hand to greet them. Her energy was infectious, her smile wide and genuine. She gestured for them to sit at the small child-sized table in the center of the room, where a neatly arranged folder awaited their attention. "Thank you for coming," Miss Parker began, her tone warm and enthusiastic. "I've been looking forward to talking about Ella. She's such a joy to have in class." Marcus and Lisa exchanged a proud glance as they settled into the tiny chairs, their knees nearly brushing the underside of the table. Miss Parker opened the folder, revealing colorful worksheets, essays written in tidy cursive, and a detailed chart of Ella's academic progress. Ella is not only excelling in mathematics and reading comprehension, Mrs. Parker continued, her voice filled with admiration, but she's also a natural leader. The other students gravitate toward her. She's thoughtful, inclusive, and always eager to help her peers. "She's always been like that," Lisa said, smiling. "Even at home, she's the one making sure everyone's okay." Miss Parker nodded knowingly. "It shows. Just last week, Ella noticed a classmate struggling with multiplication tables and started a study group during recess. She didn't even tell me. She just did it on her own. That's the kind of person she is." Marcus couldn't hide his grin. As Miss Parker continued sharing anecdotes about Ella's achievements and contributions, Marcus and Lisa felt their hearts swell with pride. Each story reaffirmed what they already knew: their daughter was extraordinary. Riverside Academy, with its inclusive environment and dedicated teachers, seemed like the perfect place for her to grow. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A woman with neatly styled, silver-streaked hair stepped inside, her presence exuding quiet confidence. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said with a warm smile. "I just wanted to introduce myself." Mrs. Parker's face brightened. "Perfect timing, Mr. and Mrs. Grant. This is Mrs. Hughes. She'll be Ella's teacher next term." Mrs. Hughes extended her hand, her grip firm yet friendly. "It's wonderful to meet you both. I've heard so many amazing things about Ella. Ms. Parker has been singing her praises for months." "Thank you," Lisa said, returning the handshake. "Ella's excited to join your class." Mrs. Hughes pulled up a chair, sitting across from them. "I'm thrilled to have her. I've reviewed her work, and I can already tell she's going to be a standout. My focus this term is on collaborative projects and critical thinking, and it sounds like Ella is exactly the kind of student who will thrive in that environment. Marcus studied her as she spoke, noting the ease with which she connected with them. Mrs. Hughes seemed genuine, her enthusiasm for teaching evident in every word. She detailed her plans for the upcoming term: science experiments, group discussions, and creative problem-solving exercises. Ella's leadership skills will be invaluable, she added, and I'm looking forward to helping her grow even further. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and shared excitement. Marcus and Lisa felt reassured. Mrs. Hughes carried herself with the same warmth and professionalism as Ms. Parker, and her dedication to nurturing her students' potential was clear. As the meeting drew to a close, Miss Parker leaned forward, her expression tinged with bittersweet emotion. "I'm going to miss having Ella in my class," she admitted. "But I know she's going to shine with Mrs. Hughes." "We'll make sure of it," Mrs. Hughes said, her smile unwavering. "Ella has a bright future ahead, and it's my privilege to be part of it." Walking back through the halls, Marcus and Lisa felt a deep sense of contentment. The evening had reinforced everything they had hoped for when they chose Riverside Academy. Here was a place where their daughters' talents were recognized and celebrated, where dedicated teachers worked tirelessly to ensure every child had the opportunity to thrive. "That went well," Lisa said, squeezing Marcus's hand as they stepped outside into the crisp evening air. "It did," Marcus agreed, glancing back at the glowing windows of the school. "Ella's in good hands." Either of them could have imagined how quickly that trust would be tested. The first rays of sunlight crept through Ella's bedroom window, casting a golden glow over her carefully arranged desk. Books, neatly stacked notebooks, and colorful pens reflected her excitement for the day ahead. Today marked the beginning of her time in Mrs. Hughes' class, and she couldn't wait to dive into the new experiences her teacher had promised. "Ella, breakfast is ready," Lisa called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warmth of a new beginning. Ella bounced down the stairs, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was already dressed in her crisp school uniform, the buttons perfectly aligned and her hair braided neatly, courtesy of her mother the night before. She entered the kitchen, her face glowing with anticipation. "Morning, sunshine," Marcus greeted her, setting a plate of pancakes in front of her. "Ready to show them what you're made of?" Ella nodded enthusiastically, pouring syrup over her pancakes. "Jenny told me Mrs. Hughes has a science experiment planned for today. I can't wait to see what it is." Lisa sat beside her, smiling as Ella chatted about her expectations for the new class. She had always been a talkative, curious child, full of questions and ideas. Watching her now, Lisa felt a surge of pride mixed with gratitude. The decision to move to this neighborhood, with its excellent schools and vibrant community, had been worth every sacrifice. "Don't forget to tell us all about it when you get home," Lisa reminded her as Ella finished the last bite of her breakfast and grabbed her backpack. "I will," Ella promised, hugging both her parents tightly before bounding out the door. Marcus and Lisa followed, watching as she climbed aboard the bus, waving until it disappeared down the street. The day felt promising, full of the kind of hope that came with fresh starts. Marcus and Lisa spent the morning discussing work and catching up on chores, imagining the stories Ella would bring home about her new class. But as the afternoon sun began to fade, a quiet unease settled over them. When the school bus finally arrived, they both rushed to the door, eager to greet their daughter. Ella stepped off the bus slowly, her usual bounce missing. Her head was slightly bowed, her shoulders tense. Marcus and Lisa exchanged a glance as Ella approached the house. "Hey, sweetheart," Marcus said gently, crouching down to her level. "How was your first day?" "It was fine," Ella replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Fine? Come on, tell us more," Lisa pressed, trying to draw her out. "Did you get to do the science experiment?" Ella shrugged, brushing past them and heading straight for the stairs. "I'm just tired. Can I go to my room?" Lisa hesitated. "Of course. But don't forget dinner's in an hour." "I know," Ella said, already halfway up the stairs. "I'll come down." Marcus and Lisa stood in silence for a moment, the usual chatter of Ella's day glaringly absent. "That's not like her," Marcus finally said, his brow furrowing. "She was so excited this morning." Lisa nodded, concern etched across her face. "Maybe it was just a long day. First days can be overwhelming." But something didn't sit right with either of them. When Ella came down for dinner, her behavior was no less unsettling. She sat at the table quietly, her usual enthusiasm for helping set the table or serve food replaced by a distant silence. Marcus noticed how she ate with an intensity he'd never seen before, almost as if she hadn't eaten all day. The honey-glazed chicken, her favorite, disappeared from her plate within minutes, and she reached for seconds without a word. "Wow, slow down, kiddo," Marcus said lightly, trying to lift the mood. "You're eating like you've been starving." Ella froze for a moment, her fork hovering midair, before continuing with the same mechanical rhythm. Lisa tried to engage her in conversation. "Did you make any new friends today? How's Mrs. Hughes?" At the mention of her teacher's name, Ella's fork clattered against her plate. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, her face carefully blank. "Everything's fine," she said flatly, refusing to meet their eyes. "Can I be excused? I'm really tired." "Of course, sweetheart," Lisa said softly, but the worried glance she exchanged with Marcus spoke volumes. As Ella retreated to her room, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. Lisa nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Maybe it's just nerves. New teacher, new classmates. It could be a lot for her." "I'm going to find out. Start just basic education. I mean, the garage hand is all but as if it's getting turned on. If I find out what's going on in there." That night, as they tucked Ella into bed, she clutched her favorite stuffed elephant, a habit she hadn't shown in years. Her parents kissed her goodnight, and their reassurances of love lingering in the room long after they'd left. Marcus lay awake long after Lisa had fallen asleep, his mind replaying every detail of the evening. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was bothering Ella wasn't something she could handle on her own. The next morning, Marcus made up his mind. He couldn't shake the unease from the previous evening. The image of Ella's strained expression and robotic eating burned into his memory. As Lisa got ready for work, Marcus casually mentioned that he'd take a personal day. "Thought I'd drive Ella to school today," he said, pouring a cup of coffee. "Make it special for her second day." Lisa smiled, touched by what she saw as a father's sweet gesture. "She'll love that," she replied. What Marcus didn't share was the deeper reason for his decision. He planned to stay near the school, keeping a close eye on Ella's day. Something about her behavior felt off, and his instincts told him there was more to the story than first-day jitters. When Ella came down for breakfast, she was subdued but polite, nibbling at her toast without her usual enthusiasm. Marcus watched her carefully, noting the tension in her posture and the way her eyes avoided his. "Ready for another big day, Princess?" he asked lightly, hoping to spark some excitement. "Yeah," she replied softly, her voice lacking its usual spark. The drive to Riverside Academy was quiet. Marcus tried to make conversation, but Ella's answers were short and vague. As they pulled up to the school, Marcus turned to her. "You know you can tell me anything, right? No matter what." Ella nodded, her eyes fixed on her backpack. "I know, Daddy. Thanks for driving me." He watched her walk toward the school building, her steps hesitant. As she disappeared inside, Marcus parked his car at a discreet distance, ready to begin his observation. He adjusted his seat to have a clear view of the playground and cafeteria windows. The hours stretched on, but he remained vigilant, determined to uncover the source of Ella's distress. When recess began, Marcus's heart sank. Ella was on the playground, but something about her demeanor was all wrong. Instead of laughing and playing with friends, she lingered near the edges of the play area, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Occasionally, a classmate would approach her and she'd offer a small smile, but she quickly retreated to the sidelines. It was as if she was trying to make herself invisible. Marcus clenched the steering wheel, his protective instincts roaring to life. Whatever was happening, it was already affecting his daughter in ways he couldn't ignore. As lunchtime approached, Marcus shifted his focus to the cafeteria. He knew Ella's class had the second lunch period, and he waited with growing anticipation. When her group finally arrived, he watched carefully as students filed through the lunch line, receiving their trays of food. Everything seemed normal, until it was Ella's turn. Mrs. Hughes appeared behind the serving counter, her presence unexpected and out of place. She leaned in to speak with the cafeteria staff, who exchanged confused glances before stepping aside. Marcus's stomach tightened as he watched Mrs. Hughes pick up a tray and carefully place something on it. Her lips moved, sent something Marcus couldn't hear, but the smirk on her face sent a chill down his spine. Ella took the tray reluctantly, her head bowed, and made her way to an isolated table near the back of the cafeteria. From his vantage point, Marcus could see the contents of her tray, and the sight made his blood run cold. In the center of the tray was a fried frog. Its legs sprawled grotesquely, its shiny skin glistening under the cafeteria lights. It was unlike anything the other children were eating, their trays filled with the usual options of sandwiches, spaghetti, and salads. Marcus's heart pounded as he tried to process what he was seeing. His mind raced back to Ella's unusual appetite at dinner the previous night. Was this what she'd been served yesterday too? He couldn't ignore the horrifying implication of Mrs. Yu's actions. Unable to sit by any longer, Marcus threw open his car door and strode toward the school building. his steps quick and purposeful. When he entered the cafeteria, the chatter of children died down as his presence drew attention. He scanned the room until his eyes locked on Ella, sitting alone with her tray untouched. "Ella!" he called, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. Her head snapped up, and for a moment he saw pure fear in her eyes, not of him, but of the situation she was trapped in. She jumped up from her seat and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Marcus knelt down, holding her tightly as she buried her face in his shirt. "Baby, what's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Who gave you that food?" Ella's voice was barely a whisper. "Mrs. Hughes," she said, her words catching in her throat. She said, "This is what people like us eats." Marcus felt a surge of rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He looked over Ella's shoulder at the tray, the grotesque meal sitting there like a twisted joke. Around them, other students stared, some whispering, others looking guilty, as if they'd known something was wrong, but hadn't spoken up. "Stay with me, baby," Marcus said, pulling out his phone with one hand while keeping the other protectively around Ella. He dialed 911, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I need to report a hate crime," he said when the operator answered. "At Riverside Academy, a teacher is deliberately targeting my daughter with racist behavior. She served her an inedible meal and made derogatory comments. I need officers here immediately." The operator's calm professionalism helped ground him. "Officers are on their way, sir. Please remain where you are." Marcus ended the call and looked into Ella's tear-streaked face. "We're going to wait for the police in the car, okay? You don't have to be here anymore." Ella nodded, clutching his hand tightly as they walked out of the cafeteria. Marcus held her close, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation he knew was coming. Mrs. Hughes's actions weren't just cruel, they were criminal, and he was going to make sure she faced the consequences. The police arrived within minutes of Marcus's call, their cruiser pulling up to Riverside Academy with its lights flashing, Ella clinging to his side, still wrapped in the emergency blanket he had taken from the trunk. Marcus stood near his car, Ella clinging to his size. Ella slipped back from within his jacket. "Mr. Grant?" Officer Carter approached with a clipboard in hand. "We received your call. Can you tell us what happened?" Marcus nodded, his voice steady despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "My daughter was targeted by her teacher, Mrs. Hughes. She was served an inedible meal, a fried frog, and was told, 'This is what people like you eat.' This wasn't a joke or a mistake. It was deliberate and malicious." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "A fried frog? In a school cafeteria?" "I'm not exaggerating," Marcus said firmly. "If you need proof, the tray is still in the cafeteria. Other students saw what happened and some recorded it on their phones." Officer Carter exchanged a glance with his partner before nodding. "We'll need to see the evidence and speak with the principal." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Ella's shoulder. "Princess, stay here for a moment, okay? I'll be right back." Ella nodded quietly, her grip tightening on the blanket as she watched her father and the officers head toward the school. Inside the cafeteria, the scene was much as Marcus had left it. The grotesque tray sat untouched on the table, the fried frog stark against the white plastic. Officer Carter's expression darkened as he photographed the tray. The older officer, initially skeptical, grew silent as he inspected the evidence. "This isn't something the lunch staff would prepare," Officer Carter said, his tone heavy. "Ella!" he called, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. Her head snapped up, and for a moment he saw pure fear in her eyes. Not of him, but of the situation she was trapped in. She jumped up from her seat and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Marcus knelt down, holding her tightly as she buried her face in his shirt. "Baby, what's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Who gave you that food?" Ella's voice was barely a whisper. "Mrs. Hughes," she said, her words catching in her throat. She said, "This is what people like us eat." "Ella, can you say this is what people like us eat?" Marcus felt a surge of rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He looked over Ella's shoulder at the tray, the grotesque meal sitting there like a twisted joke. Around them other students stared, some whispering, others looking guilty, as if they'd known something was wrong but hadn't spoken up. "Stay with me, baby," Marcus said, pulling out his phone with one hand while keeping the other protectively around Ella. He dialed 911, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I need to report a hate crime," he said when the operator answered. "At Riverside Academy, a teacher is deliberately targeting my daughter with racist behavior. She served her an inedible meal and made derogatory comments. I need officers here immediately." The operator's calm professionalism helped ground him. "Officers are on their way, sir. Please remain where you are." Marcus ended the call and looked into Ella's tear-streaked face. "We're going to wait for the police in the car, okay? You don't have to be here anymore." "Ella?" Dust clutching his hand tightly as they walked out of the cafeteria. Marcus held her close, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation he knew was coming. Mrs. Hughes's actions weren't just cruel, they were criminal, and he was going to make sure she faced the consequences. The police arrived within minutes of Marcus's call, their cruiser pulling up to Riverside Academy with its lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, a middle-aged white officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, and a younger black officer who introduced himself as Officer Carter. Marcus stood near his car, Ella clinging to his side, still wrapped in the emergency blanket he had taken from the trunk. "Mr. Grant?" Officer Carter approached with a clipboard in hand. "We received your call. Can you tell us what happened?" Marcus nodded, his voice steady despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "My daughter was targeted by her teacher, Mrs. Hughes. She was served an inedible meal, a fried frog, and was told, 'This is what people like you eat.' This wasn't a joke or a mistake. It was deliberate and malicious." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "A fried frog in a school cafeteria?" "I'm not exaggerating," Marcus said firmly. "If you need proof, the tray is still in the cafeteria. Other students saw what happened, and some recorded it on their phones." Officer Carter exchanged a glance with his partner before nodding. "We'll need to see the evidence and speak with the principal." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Ella's shoulder. Princess, stay here for a moment, okay? I'll be right back." Ella nodded quietly, her grip tightening on the blanket as she watched her father and the officers head toward the school. Inside the cafeteria, the scene was much as Marcus had left it. The grotesque tray sat untouched on the table, the fried frog stark against the white plastic. Officer Carter's expression darkened as he photographed the tray. The older officer, initially skeptical, grew silent as he inspected the evidence. "This isn't something the lunch staff would prepare," Officer Carter said, his tone heavy. "We'll need to speak with the cafeteria workers and check the security cameras." Marcus felt a surge of vindication as the officers began taking his claims seriously. Principal Reynolds, a tall, composed man with salt and pepper hair, arrived moments later, visibly concerned. "Mr. Grant," he greeted Marcus. "I just heard about the incident. I assure you this school has zero tolerance for any form of discrimination." "Then you'll want to follow me to Mrs. Hughes' classroom," Marcus said, his voice cold. "She needs to answer for what she did." The small group made their way through the hallways, their footsteps echoing ominously. When they entered Mrs. Hughes's classroom, she looked up from her desk, her expression neutral at first. Then her lips curled into a faint smirk. "Mr. Grant," she said smoothly, as though greeting an old friend, "what brings you here?" Marcus didn't waste time. "I'm here because of what you did to my daughter," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Explain why you served her a fried frog for lunch and made a racist comment about it." Mrs. Hughes leaned back in her chair, feigning confusion. "I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't play games," Marcus snapped. "There are witnesses. Students recorded it. The evidence is in the cafeteria." Her expression remained cool. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Perhaps your daughter is exaggerating?" Marcus stepped forward, but Officer Carter placed a hand on his shoulder, silently urging restraint. "Mrs. Hughes," Officer Carter said firmly, "we've seen the evidence. There's a tray in the cafeteria with an item that doesn't match the standard lunch menu. We'll also be reviewing the security footage. If you'd like to clarify your actions, now is the time." Mrs. Hughes's smirk faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I've done nothing wrong," she said dismissively. "If there's some misunderstanding, I'm sure it can be resolved without dramatics." Principal Reynolds cleared his throat, his face grim. "Mrs. Hughes, this is a serious allegation. If there's any truth to it, you'll face disciplinary action at the very least." "There's no truth to it," she retorted, her voice growing sharper. "This is absurd." The older officer's radio crackled to life, and he stepped out to take the call. Moments later, he returned, his expression grave. "We've reviewed the preliminary footage from the cafeteria cameras," he announced. "It clearly shows Mrs. Hughes taking over the lunch line, speaking with the staff, and personally serving the meal in question to Ella Grant." For the first time, Mrs. Hughes's composure cracked. Her eyes darted between the officers and Principal Reynolds. "That footage doesn't prove anything," she said hastily. "It was a joke. The kid misunderstood." Make no joke, make no joke." Marcus's voice thundered through the room. "You call humiliating a child a joke? Telling her this is what people like her eat? That's not a joke. It's hatred." Officer Carter turned to Mrs. Hughes. Ma'am, we also have testimonies from students who witnessed the incident. Based on the evidence, we're placing you under arrest for committing a hate crime and child endangerment. The color drained from Mrs. Hughes's face. You can't be serious, she sputtered. This is ridiculous. I'm not racist. Then why target my daughter? Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with fury. Why humiliate her in front of her classmates? Officer Carter stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Mrs. Hughes, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the officers escorted her out of the classroom, Mrs. Hughes's protests grew louder, her carefully constructed facade crumbling with every step. Marcus watched her go, his chest heaving as the weight of the confrontation began to settle. Principal Reynolds turned to Marcus, his expression a mix of shock and apology. Mr. Grant, he said quietly, I can't express how deeply sorry I am. This is unacceptable. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation and take immediate steps to ensure this never happens again. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. This isn't just about my daughter, he said. This is about every child who deserves to feel safe and respected here. As he left the school that day, Marcus's thoughts returned to Ella, waiting in the car. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Justice had taken its first step, and he would make sure its course. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than words. Ella sat in the back seat, still wrapped in the emergency blanket, her small frame huddled into the corner as if she wanted to disappear. Marcus glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the sight of his daughter's usually vibrant spirit, dimmed by the events of the day. Lisa sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly, her face etched with worry. As they pulled into the driveway, Lisa turned to Ella. Sweetheart, let's go inside and get comfortable. We'll talk when you're ready, okay? Ella nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus helped her out of the car, his hand steady on her shoulder as they made their way into the house. Once inside, Lisa led Ella to the couch, wrapping her in a soft throw blanket and offering her a glass of water. Marcus sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes filled with concern. Baby, he began gently, can you tell us how you're feeling? What happened today? It wasn't right. None of it was your fault. Ella hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of the blanket. Finally she looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. I didn't understand at first, she said, her voice trembling. When she gave me that thing on my tray, I thought maybe it was a mistake, but then she said this is what people like you eat. Her voice cracked and she buried her face in her hands. I felt so embarrassed. Everyone was staring at me. I didn't know what to do. Lisa moved to sit beside her, pulling her into a hug. Oh, honey, she whispered, stroking Ella's hair. You didn't deserve any of that, not one bit. What she did was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. Ella sniffled, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. But why? Why would she do that to me? I didn't do anything to her. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Because some people, baby, have hate in their hearts. It has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with their own ignorance. Mrs. Hughes didn't target you because of anything you did. She did it because of who she is. A person who can't see past her own prejudice. Ella pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face looking at her father. But why didn't anyone stop her? Why did my classmates just watch? Lisa's grip on her tightened. Sometimes people don't know how to react when they see something wrong. They freeze or they stay quiet because they're scared. But that doesn't mean they thought it was okay. You were brave, Ella, Marcus added. You endured something terrible, but you didn't let it break you. And now that we know what happened, we're going to make sure it never happens again, to you or anyone else. Ella nodded slowly, her breathing evening out as her parents' reassurances sank in. She leaned into her mother's embrace, her small body finally relaxing. Later that evening, after Ella had gone to bed, still clutching her stuffed elephant for comfort, Marcus and Lisa sat at the kitchen table, a pot of untouched coffee between them. The weight of the day pressed heavily on both of them, the silence only broken by the occasional clink of Lisa's spoon against her mug. We thought we were doing everything right, Lisa said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. We moved here because we thought it would be different. Better. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. We wanted her to have a chance to grow up without having to deal with the same things we did, but here we are. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. What hurts the most is knowing she felt so alone that she thought she couldn't tell us. She's been through this before, Marcus said quietly, his hands clasped tightly together. At her old school, it was the kids. This time, it was someone we were supposed to trust, a teacher. It's worse because it came from someone who should have been protecting her. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation settling over them. Finally, Lisa straightened, her expression resolute. We can't let this end here, Marcus. It's not just about Ella anymore. It's about every child who walks into that school trusting that they'll be treated with dignity. Marcus nodded. We'll make sure the school implements real changes, diversity training, oversight, whatever it takes. And we'll follow through with the case against Mrs. Hughes. She doesn't get to walk away from this. Lisa reached across the table, taking his hand. We'll fight for her, together. Marcus squeezed her hand, his expression softening. Always. And we'll make sure Ella knows she's never alone. Not now. Not ever. As the clock ticked toward midnight, they finally allowed themselves to breathe. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to see it through. For Ella, for every child like her, and for the promise of a better, fairer world. In the days following the incident, the Grants refused to let the matter fade into the background. Marcus reached out to the school board, filing an official complaint and demanding an immediate investigation into the policies and culture at Riverside Academy. Lisa worked tirelessly to draft letters to local representatives, civil rights organizations, and media outlets. They both knew this wasn't just about Mrs. Hughes, about the systemic issues that allowed someone like her to operate unchecked in a place meant to nurture and educate children. Their efforts quickly gained traction. The story of Ella's ordeal spread across social media, shared by outraged parents and activists who saw the incident as a symptom of a larger problem. Local news stations picked up the story, and within days, national outlets were calling for interviews. Marcus and Lisa appeared on morning shows and podcasts, recounting the events with raw emotion and unwavering determination. "This isn't just about our daughter," Marcus said during one interview. "This is about every child who's been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. It's about creating an environment where our children can thrive without fear of being targeted." The public response was overwhelming. Emails and messages poured in from parents, educators, and community leaders, many sharing similar experiences and offering support. The school board announced a formal investigation into Riverside Academy, promising transparency and immediate action. Marcus and Lisa were invited to participate in the review process, providing input on necessary reforms. During a packed town hall meeting organized by the school board, Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady but filled with passion. "It's not enough to say this was an isolated incident," he said, addressing the crowd. "We need to ask why it happened and how we can prevent it from happening again. Our children deserve better." The board outlined a series of changes, including mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, the creation of an oversight committee, and a hotline for students and parents to report concerns anonymously. Principal Reynolds personally apologized to the Grants, admitting that the school had failed Ella and promising to rebuild trust within the community. As the spotlight on the incident grew, Ella's name became synonymous with courage. At first, she was hesitant to talk about what had happened. The attention felt overwhelming and the memories of Mrs. Hughes's actions were still fresh. But with the help of therapy, Ella began to process her emotions and regain her sense of self-worth. In weekly sessions with a compassionate therapist, Ella learned to separate Mrs. Hughes's hateful words from her own identity. "What happened to you says everything about Mrs. Hughes and nothing about you," the therapist told her. Slowly, Ella started to believe it. At home, Marcus and Lisa fostered an environment of love and empowerment. They encouraged Ella to speak up when she was ready, reminding her that her voice could make a difference. One evening, as the family sat together after dinner, Ella surprised them by saying, "I want to talk about it." Lisa set down her cup of tea, her eyes soft with encouragement. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart." "I think," Ella paused, gathering her thoughts, "I think if I tell my story, maybe it will help other kids. Maybe they won't feel so alone." Marcus leaned forward, pride shining in his eyes. "Your voice is powerful, Ella. If that's what you want to do, we'll be right beside you." A few weeks later, Ella stood in front of a room filled with students, parents, and teachers during a school assembly. Her small hands gripped the microphone tightly, but her voice was steady as she began. "My name is Ella Grant," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "A few weeks ago, something happened to me that made me feel small and scared. But I realized that staying quiet wouldn't make it better. Speaking up would." She went on to recount her experience, not with bitterness but with a sense of purpose. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. We're all different, but that's what makes us special. And no one has the right to make you feel like you don't belong. The room erupted in applause as Ella finished, her parents standing in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. That night, Marcus and Lisa tucked her into bed with a sense of hope they hadn't felt in weeks. "You were amazing today," Lisa said, kissing her forehead. "I was just being me," Ella replied sleepily. "That's what you always tell me to do." Over time, Ella's confidence continued to grow. She joined a local youth council focused on diversity and inclusion, helping to create programs that celebrated cultural differences. Her story became a rallying cry for change, inspiring others to speak out and demand better. For Marcus and Lisa, the journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. They had turned a moment of pain into a movement for progress, teaching Ella and themselves that standing up against injustice was always the right choice. Together, as a family, they proved that even in the face of hate, love and resilience could shine brighter. As the weeks turned into months, the Grants found themselves reflecting on everything that had transpired. Sitting together in their living room one evening, Marcus and Lisa watched Ella quietly sketching at the dining table. The vibrant child they had always known was re-emerging, her laughter more frequent, her confidence slowly rebuilding. Yet the scars of what she had endured lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the challenges they faced as parents, raising a black child in a world still grappling with racism. "It's hard sometimes," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft but resolute, knowing that no matter how much we try to shield her, there will always be people like Mrs. Hughes. Lisa nodded, her gaze fixed on Ella. "But we can't let that stop us. We've seen what can happen when people stay silent. If we want a better world for her, we have to keep fighting." "That's what this taught me," Marcus said, leaning forward. It's not enough to move to the right neighborhood or send her to the best school. Racism isn't bound by geography or status. It's systemic, and it takes action to uproot it. Lisa turned to him, her eyes filled with determination. "And that's exactly what we're doing. For her, for every kid like her." The conversation was interrupted by Ella's voice. "Mom? Dad?" she called, holding up a drawing she'd been working on. It was a picture of a classroom filled with students of all colors, smiling and holding hands. At the center was a teacher with a warm expression, standing beside the words, "Everyone belongs." "That's beautiful, Princess," Marcus said, smiling as he stood to admire her work. "I want to bring it to school," Ella said, a touch of shyness in her voice. "Maybe we can hang it up in the hallway, so everyone knows what kind of place it should be." Lisa knelt beside her, brushing a stray braid from Ella's face. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. It shows everyone how kind and brave you are." Ella beamed, her cheeks flushing with pride. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've already made a difference, Ella. Every time you speak up, every time you share your story, you inspire people to be better." The following week, Ella stood once again in front of her peers, teachers, and parents at a school assembly. This time, her heart felt lighter. She no longer carried the burden of shame or confusion. Instead, she felt empowered. As she took the microphone, she glanced at her parents sitting in the front row. Their supportive smiles gave her the courage to begin. "Hi, I'm Ella Grant," she said, her voice steady and clear. "A little while ago, something happened to me that made me feel small and scared. But I learned that staying silent wouldn't make things better. Talking about it, sharing it, that's what helped." She paused, looking out at the crowd. We all have differences, and those differences are what make us special, but no one should ever make you feel like you don't belong because of who you are. We have to stand up for each other and speak out against prejudice. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then applause broke out, growing louder and more fervent as students, teachers, and parents rose to their feet. Ella smiled, a mix of relief and pride washing over her. Marcus and Lisa watched, their hearts swelling with emotion. Their daughter had turned her pain into purpose, and in doing so, had become a beacon of hope for others. As the applause continued, Marcus leaned toward Lisa. "She's stronger than I ever imagined," he said, his voice thick with pride. "She always was," Lisa replied, wiping a tear from her cheek. That night, as they tucked Ella into bed, she hugged them tightly. "I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad," she said, her voice muffled by the stuffed elephant in her arms. "We love you too, sweetheart," Lisa whispered, kissing her forehead. "More than you'll ever know." As Marcus turned out the light, he paused in the doorway, watching Ella drift off to sleep. The weight of the past weeks still lingered, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. They had faced a nightmare and emerged stronger, more united than ever. Inevitable within events leading up to a National Terrorism Day of 2022. 3 deep breaths and sighed. "And we'll make sure she knows she's never alone," Lisa added. In that moment, they knew they had not only survived a painful chapter, but had transformed it into a lesson in courage and advocacy. Their family's resilience had become their greatest strength, and they were ready to face whatever came next, with love, determination, and unshakable belief in a brighter future. The story of the Grants highlights a powerful truth. Injustice can thrive even in the places we believe are the most inclusive and progressive. It serves as a sobering reminder that complacency is not an option. Speaking out against prejudice and standing up for what's right isn't just a moral duty. It's a necessity for fostering real, lasting change. By sharing their experiences and demanding accountability, the Grants didn't just fight for their daughter. They fought for every child who deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued. Their courage shows us that progress isn't about pretending problems don't exist. It's about confronting them head-on, even in environments where discrimination hides beneath a facade of acceptance. True progress begins when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. It's in those moments, when we choose to act, that we create the possibility for a better, more equitable future. For Ella, for her peers, and for all of us. This story is a testament to the power of resilience, advocacy, and the unwavering belief in a world where everyone truly belongs.